Week 11 of fantasy football season, and here's a few kickers I would start this week. The first guy, Nick Folk of the New England Patriots. And Nick Folk, he's been solid and one of the better kickers in all of fantasy football this season here. In the last few games for him, Week 7 versus the Jets, 12 fantasy points. Week 8 at the Chargers, 15. Week 9 at the Panthers, 6. And Week 10 versus the Cleveland Browns, 9. So this week, another great matchup for Nick Folk at the Atlanta Falcons that obviously a lot of teams score on. And this Patriot team, they don't punch the ball in the end zone a lot this season. So right here, it wouldn't surprise me to see Nick Folk once again reach double-digit fantasy points. And at this point, he's pretty much an each and every week start at the kicking position. The next kicker I would start this week's Chase Mclaughlin of the Cleveland Browns. So the Browns have a great matchup this week, no doubt about it, versus the winless Detroit Lions, even though they play hard each and every game, and they did tie the Pittsburgh Steelers in Week 10, even though the Steelers didn't have Big Ben in that ball game. But Chase Mclaughlin, he's got a great matchup versus Detroit that gives up the most fantasy points to kickers this season. So the last few games for Mclaughlin, Week 8 versus Pittsburgh, 4, Week 9 at Cincy, 10, and Week 10 and New England, 1. But this week here, I think he'll score anywhere from 8 to 10 fantasy points. And right now, he's available in 81% of fantasy leagues, so he's definitely a kicker I would start this week. The next kicker is Chris Boswell of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So Chris Boswell, he's been solid the last 3 or 4 weeks here for fantasy owners. Week 6 versus Seattle, 13. Week 8 at Cleveland, 3. And Week 9 versus Chicago, 14. Week 10 versus Detroit, 12. So this week here, Week 11 at the Chargers. Chargers give up the 5th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. And the Chargers defense, it's been pretty good this season for the most part in the red zone part of things. But right here, I think Chris Boswell, he's going to find a few field goal opportunities, and it wouldn't surprise me as well if he reaches double-digit fantasy points for the 3rd game in a row, because this season, this Pittsburgh offense just isn't the same like it was for many seasons. And Big Ben, we know he's getting older. We know he's declining. And it might be time for them to draft a quarterback next season. But anyway, Chris Boswell, I think he has a decent chance to get some opportunities. And he's definitely a kicker I would start this week. The next kicker, Mason Crosby of the Green Bay Packers. So Crosby, it hasn't been that good of a season this year here. A lot of single-digit fantasy games and a lot of missed field goals and extra points as well, it seems like, over the last few weeks here for Crosby. So the last few games for Crosby, Week 7 versus Washington, 4 fantasy points. Week 8 at Arizona, 6 fantasy points. Week 9 at the Chiefs, in that one, -1 fantasy points. And then Week 10 versus Seattle, 4 fantasy points. So right here in Week 11, he's got a good matchup at the Minnesota Vikings that pretty much can't stop anyone on defense. And they do give up the 4th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. So I think this ball game, Crosby gets right. It's an indoor game. You don't have to deal with the elements and cold weather, obviously, in Green Bay. And I think in this ball game, he could be a solid kicker. And I would start him this week. And the 5th and final kicker I would give a start this week is Randy Bullock of the Tennessee Titans. So Randy Bullock, he's got a good matchup versus the Houston Texans that give up the 8th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. And right here, we know the Texans are one of the worst teams in all of football. And Randy Bullock's on one of the most high-powered offenses in all of football, even though Derrick Henry's out in amount of time. And we know Julio Jones is going to be out a few weeks. But right here, the last few weeks for Bullock, Week 8 at the Colts, 12. Week 9 at the Rams, 4. And Week 10 versus the New Orleans Saints, 11 fantasy points. So right here, I think he could definitely reach double digits versus Houston. And I know Tennessee's at home in this game, and they play better at home than they do on the road. But Randy Bullock, he's been pretty consistent this season, and it's been a good bounce-back season for him. So right now also, he's available as Bullock in 78% of fantasy leagues, but he's definitely a kicker I would start this week. So that's a few kickers I would start in Week 11 of the fantasy football season.